Senate steps. And I hope that Senator Schumer will be able to join us. I thank my colleagues for joining. This meeting will come to order. 4 years ago, we witnessed one of the worst assaults on democracy in American history. It's a day that forever changed our nation. On January 6, 2021, a violent mob summoned by a bitter, defeated former president ransacked the Capitol complex, leading to the deaths of 5 police officers and injuries to more than 140 others. Later that evening, we returned to the Capitol and certified the 2020 election results. That should have been the death knell of Donald Trump's big lie, his baseless claim that the election had been stolen. But within weeks, the bipartisan resolve to defend our democracy was gone. My Republican colleagues washed their hands of what happened on January 6 and have shown zero interest in holding President Trump accountable. Meanwhile, the president continues to falsely claim that rioters who violently assaulted police officers were, quote, hostages, that was his word, hostages, who were assaulted by our government, his words again. He's even considering financial compensation for the individuals involved in these heinous crimes. Republicans are trying to rewrite the history of January 6 as a tale of martyrdom and courage in an effort to whitewash what actually happened, what we saw with our own eyes. But make no mistake, January 6 was a stain on our democracy and an attempted coup on our government. We cannot allow the president and his supporters to dishonor the heroic sacrifices, and I use that word advisedly, heroic sacrifices of law enforcement officers who protected us and defended our democracy that day. To all the law enforcement officials in the room and those who are following this hearing, from the bottom of my heart, I extend my deepest thanks and appreciation for your service, for risking your life to protect mine and others. To add insult to injury, within hours of his inauguration earlier this year, President Trump granted clemency, full unconditional pardons to more than 1,500 who descended upon the Capitol on January 6. This decision led to the immediate release of these rioters who were convicted of violent assaults on police officers. Now Justice Department attorneys are arguing that President Trump's blanket pardon should apply to serious crimes committed by these same insurrectionists after January 6. And President Trump continues to elevate those who have whitewashed January 6 and defended the rioters. A classic example, Ed Martin, the interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Martin helped lead the so-called Stop the Steal movement to overturn the 2020 election. He was on the ground at the U.S. Capitol on January 6 and claimed the insurrection was, and I quote, like Mardi Gras. Like Mardi Gras. Those are the words of the interim U.S. Attorney of the District of Columbia. Timothy Hale Cusinelli, a pardoned insurrectionist whose prosecutors identified as a, quote, white supremacist Nazi sympathizer, actually received an award from Martin, who described Cusinelli as a, quote, extraordinary man and extraordinary leader. I think there's a chart here with Cusinelli's image. You can draw your own conclusion of who he's trying to emulate. Or how about Kash Patel, now the FBI director, who infamously organized and recorded January 6 rioters singing the national anthem in the D.C. jail. One of Mr. Patel's choir boys was Julian Cater, assaulted a police officer named Brian Sicknick, who suffered multiple strokes and died after the attack. Many of the January 6 perpetrators have shown no remorse for the long-term mental and physical damage they inflicted on their victims and have engaged in a new crime spree since the insurrection. Take Edward Kelly. He was convicted in his home state of Tennessee last November of conspiracy to murder FBI officials who investigated the January 6 offenses. And just 2 short months ago, January 6 rioters held a press conference outside the Capitol to announce their intent to sue the Justice Department for prosecuting them. The group paraded around the Capitol, following the route they took on January 6 and chanting, "Whose house? Our house." After the press conference, former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio was even arrested outside the Capitol for assault. Tarrio also posted a video of himself stalking officers who defended the Capitol on January 6 and calling them cowards. We're going to hear more about that today. This sounds like a man who thinks he's above the law and expects to be bailed out by President Trump for every crime he commits. Shortly after receiving Trump's pardons, dozens of former January 6 offenders joined forces on social media to compile and publicize the identities of at least 124 individuals involved in their convictions, including prosecutors, judges, and FBI agents. The post, which was received at least 60,000 views, includes names, photos, and disparaging remarks. The threat to these public servants is clear. Government employees should have no fear for their or their family's safety simply for doing their jobs. And we in Congress have an obligation to honor the sacrifice of the men and women who bravely defended the Capitol on January 6. They deserve better than this. Today we welcome 4 witnesses. Our first is our friend Harry Dunn. Harry, it's great to see you again. 15-year veteran of the United States Capitol Police. He defended the Capitol during January 6th insurrection. Officer Dunn lobbied Congress to create the House Select Committee that investigated the attack and testified before it. He's been awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal, the Congressional Gold Medal, and the Capitol Police Service Medal for his efforts. Congratulations to you. We also welcome Mike Romano, former Deputy Chief of the Capitol Siege Section of the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. Mr. Romano, who served as federal prosecutor for almost 18 years, tried several January 6 cases to verdict, left the Justice Department after Attorney General Bondi slashed and shrank the public integrity section where he worked. He's now in private practice. Additionally, we're joined by Sarah Levine. Is it Levine or Levine? Levine. Sarah Levine, a former Assistant U.S. Attorney with the Capitol Siege Section of the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office. Ms. Levine spent a year and a half handling January 6 cases while at the department. She was terminated by interim D.C. U.S. Attorney Ed Martin. Ms. Levine has spent a total of 8 years as a prosecutor at state and federal level, currently with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office in Virginia. Finally, we're joined by Officer Daniel Hodges of the Metropolitan Police Department, who defended this body during the January 6th insurrection and testified before the House Select Committee on the matter as well. He's been with the MPD for 11 years and been awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal and the Congressional Gold Medal for his efforts. Let me lay out the mechanics of the meeting. Each witness will have 5 minutes to provide an opening statement, then rounds of questioning. Each senator will have 5 minutes to ask. Mr. Dunn, we're going to start with your opening statement and go in order across the table. Take it away, Harry.
Good afternoon. Ranking Member Durbin and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I'm thankful for this opportunity to appear before you with the chance to again continue to fight for the American people who believe that attacking police officers and storming the Capitol on a cold day in January is not the way to settle disputes about an election. At this moment, there's not much more that one could say about the events on January 6, 2021 that would come as a surprise to many people. All the facts have been laid out, the timelines have been established, the narratives have been written, and the bad players, well, most, have been held accountable. And just as fast, forgiven in the way of sentence commutations and pardons. It is truly unfortunate that January 6 has become such a partisan issue. On that day, I fought alongside officers who to this day are devoted supporters of the current president, while protecting people in this very building who either love, hate, or are indifferent to the current president. The inability for people, including members of this very body, to frankly call a spade is the ultimate betrayal and a slap in the face of law enforcement and to Americans. It is possible to still support the president and his policies while condemning him for what he encouraged and allowed to happen on that day. The Fraternal Order of Police, the FOP, was able to do so. They endorsed the current president in the past election, but they also condemned the pardons he gave indiscriminately to people who attacked and viciously beat police officers on January 6th. Elected officials in both the House and the Senate, not just here in Washington, but across the country, have shown they do not have the ability to do both. Many say that we need to get on with doing the work of the American people, and we need to move on from January 6th. I would love nothing more. I would love nothing more than to move on from talking about the worst day of my life. But as current officials attempt to rewrite what happened that day, and pardoned criminals are making runs for office and being celebrated by some, the officers, the true patriots of that day who protected this very building, and many of the people sitting here before me, we have become nothing but afterthoughts. There's a plaque that was supposed to be hung in the Capitol, passed by the last Congress, that has still not seen the light of day. Sure, many have their own personal thoughts and beliefs about why what happened on January 6th happened, but under no circumstances can you debate what happened on that day. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to the elected officials. Don't listen to the political pundits on cable news. Turn the volume down and just press play. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thanks, Officer Dunn. Senator Schumer, our leader on the Democratic side, has been able to join us, and I want to turn the microphone over to him.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank, I don't know which one's on. There we go. I want to thank Senator Durbin and all of my members, all the Senate members for being here, and thank you, our great witnesses, and thank you, officer. So January 6th, of course, stays emblazoned in all of our minds. I had just learned at 4 in the morning that I was going to be majority leader because our 2 senators from Georgia won. Get in the car, finally get to the floor of the Senate at 1 p.m., and within an hour, my first time sitting as puted majority leader, I feel an arm yank my collar. It was a member of my detail, Officer Mike Lazinski, saying, "We're in danger, get out of here." And then I looked up at the podium and I saw our Vice President being evacuated. They rushed me out. We walked through a hallway and opened a door. And I was within 30 feet of these insurrectionist, I guess this is a proper hearing, sons of guns. One of them saw me. "There's the big Jew. Let's get him." And because of the bravery of my police detail and Officer Lazinski, we ran the other way and escaped. Had one of them had a gun, had one of them blocked the door, Lord knows what would have happened. To allow these vicious people who have no respect for democracy, and with many of them no respect for other human lives, we've seen what's happened, to be pardoned, to be exonerated, is one of the very low points in American history, in all of American history. The only thing we can do, because Trump has this pardon power, which he uses to a vicious, nasty, and un-American end, is to bring to light what happened and remind people what happened. And remind who's in the White House, the caliber, the low caliber of the man in the White House who would do something like this. So your being here is extremely important, not only to recall what happened that day to all of you, but to remind America that this man doesn't deserve to be president. This man doesn't deserve to be president. So I want to thank you for coming. I don't want to take up too much time, but I felt I had to be here to make that point and to show how important this hearing is. And I salute Senator Durbin and the members of the Judiciary Committee for having it. America, we will not, there are certain things you can't forget. You must never let people forget. All the genocides that have occurred over the centuries, we can't let people forget that. I was at Armenian Remembrance Day and Holocaust Remembrance Day last Sunday. But this rises to that category. Never, never forget. Thanks,
Thank you, Senator Schumer. Mr. Romano.
Thank you, Ranking Member Durbin, Leader Schumer, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I worked at the Justice Department in various offices for almost 18 years. For the past 4 years, I was part of the team at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office that investigated and prosecuted crimes committed on January 6th, 2021. On January 6th, like many other Americans, I learned about the Capitol riot on the news as it was happening. I turned on my television and saw thousands of people storming the Capitol, apparently bent on forcing Congress to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. I was disgusted, and more importantly, I was afraid. I was afraid of what these rioters might do, and I was afraid they would never face consequences. I'm proud to have joined the effort to hold them accountable. Thanks to the work of our team, the Justice Department charged more than 1,500 people with crimes and obtained criminal convictions against almost 1,300 people. We ensured that the rioters would face accountability, no matter how short-lived. Our work created a public record of the crimes committed that day. It can be challenging to understand what happened during the riot. Americans reading my written statement or watching this hearing will not have the visceral, lived experience of an officer who defended the Capitol. They will not have the granular knowledge of the events of that day that FBI agents and prosecutors came to possess. With that in mind, I want to convey 3 lessons from my experience to my fellow Americans. First, the riot at the Capitol was a violent event. Hundreds of police officers were assaulted. Reviewing the evidence, I witnessed rioters attack officers with poles, metal pipes, bear spray, stun guns, chairs, bike rack barricades, broken pieces of furniture, and in one case, an explosive device. Officers were injured, some badly so. Senators, members of Congress, and staffers were forced to shelter in place, some fearing they would never make it home. Inside the Capitol, rioters called for the Vice President of the United States to be dragged out of the building and hanged. This was not a day of love, and it never has been. These rioters are not and never have been patriots. The riot was a violent assault on our democracy made up of numerous individual violent assaults of the people who stood in its defense. Second, the prosecution of misdemeanor defendants was critically important to our mission. It's easy to hear the word misdemeanor and think a crime is minor or even insignificant, but there were no small crimes on January 6th. The people charged with misdemeanors were basically accused of trespassing at the Capitol. They entered and remained knowing they should not have done so. Their presence enabled the mob violence. Without the volume of people who stormed the Capitol, less violence would have been committed, less damage would have been done. As one judge recognized, every raindrop contributes to a flood. And based on the evidence I've reviewed, many misdemeanor defendants understood exactly what the violent rioters meant to accomplish. They knowingly lent their bodies to the effort, even if they committed no violence themselves. Third, the rioters were treated fairly. They had skilled attorneys representing them. They challenged the evidence against them. Many took their cases to trial, testified, and made arguments to juries of their peers. In short, all of their constitutional rights were protected, and they were convicted in overwhelming numbers. Some have used our success to argue that the rioters were treated unfairly, that they were railroaded. The truth is, the rioters were convicted in such large numbers because the evidence against them was so powerful. On January 6th, the rioters were proud of their behavior. Many of them filmed their crimes using their own cell phones, texted their friends, and bragged about what they had done. Prosecutors dream of evidence this powerful. If these rioters think they were treated unfairly, it is because many of them thought, and apparently still think, they deserve to be seen as heroes. It's been a privilege to serve my country as a prosecutor, including by prosecuting these rioters. The riot was a mass crime of historic proportions, and it is incumbent on all of us not to forget what happened that day. It is a privilege to speak with you all today, Senators, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romano. Ms. Levine?
Thank you, Ranking Member Durbin, for organizing this, and the other members of the Senate Judiciary Committee for being here today. I have been a prosecutor for almost 8 years. I spent 1.5 years of that time working at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. in the Capitol Siege section, prosecuting the crimes that occurred on January 6th during that violent riot that took place at the Capitol building. Before I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, I started my legal career as a county prosecutor in Pima County, Arizona. For those unfamiliar with the area, Tucson is the largest city within Pima County, and the county stretches to the Mexican border. It also includes multiple tribal jurisdictions, and while our office dealt with local crime, the office location always meant that we had to deal with other issues related to the drug trade and gangs, and immigration concerns were a daily part of life for defendants and victims alike. This is where I learned to be a prosecutor. One of the first things that that office instilled in me was the highest respect for my ethical obligation as a prosecutor. Prosecutors have the ability to do something that no other attorney can. We can take away someone's freedom. This is a sacred responsibility, and with that responsibility comes a higher ethical obligation. That obligation includes following the facts, the law, and the Constitution. It means I can't go forward with a case based on feelings or opinions about those that are involved. In Pima County, I learned that being a prosecutor is about serving the whole community. I never once asked anyone about their political affiliation before helping them. Prosecution is nonpartisan. If a crime was committed, we pursued justice using the law and the evidence. We served the whole community and attempted to make it a safer place. This is where I worked on January 6, 2021. It was a disturbing event, but in Tucson, Arizona, it did not affect our everyday lives. So I, like many Americans, knew it was a terrible event, but I didn't think much about it. Then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I had the amazing opportunity to join the U.S. Attorney's Office. I accepted because I knew it was important work where I could serve my country in a unique and important way. When I started the job, I quickly learned that I knew nothing about what happened on January 6th. I had no idea about how violent it had been. I was surprised that Congress members and their staff were truly terrified that they would not survive. I was shocked as I watched footage of rioters violently attacking police officers with poles, riot shields, sticks, and crutches. Rioters telling officers that they support police and then attacking them. This was not just people forcing their way into the building. This was a siege of the Capitol. I was astonished to learn how close we came to losing democracy that day. And after seeing this mayhem and letting the gravity of it sink in, I got to work. The cases changed, but the work was the same. I followed the law and the evidence. I was guided by my ethics. If a crime was committed, I charged a case. I took cases to trial where the evidence supported it, and I declined cases where the evidence was lacking. I assessed criminal actions regardless of who committed them. I followed my oath to protect the Constitution. I have talked with many of the officers who were there that day. Most suffered some sort of injury, and all of them suffered some trauma from that experience. They are incredibly strong, brave individuals that did something very few would do. They are the true heroes of that day. The officers that testified talked about how they'd never seen a riot like January 6th. These were officers that had worked during the protests over the summer of 2020. They were officers that saw violent crime on a regular basis, but this was different. The rioters were dressed in gear like for war, combat helmets and body armor. They carried weapons like batons and flagpoles and stun guns. They were undeterred by the police. The officers who stood in the inauguration tunnel for hours, the same one that the president walks out of, talked about trying to stay on their feet. They didn't know if they were going to make it home that day. They stood in the doorway for hours to protect the members of Congress, staffers, and those others inside the building. Another officer who was in the initial breach near Peace Circle testified in court that the sound of his fellow police officer's head hitting the concrete stairs as she was knocked over by rioters lives in his head rent-free. His words still echo in my head often. That officer's attackers were among the pardoned. After the election, it became clear that the Capitol C section would be dissolved when the new administration came to power. There's a lot of uncertainty about how quickly it would happen and what would happen to the more than 1,500 defendants who were already charged for acts committed during the riot. I knew some of them would be pardoned, but naively I thought that that would not include those who attacked police that day. Before the administration change, I agreed to join the Superior Court Division of the office. Superior Court prosecutes local crime in D.C., and I thought I could serve the community. I wanted to continue to serve regardless of the administration. In January, I trained to join, and then on January 20th, 2025, the president pardoned almost all of the defendants charged on January 6th and commuted the sentence of every other rioter. I was heartbroken. All that effort to pursue justice for the officers and the country was wiped away with a single proclamation. This was an injustice to the community and to the victims of that day. However, it did not change what happened that day. There is a record of all that violence that happened that day through court records and videos that no pardon will ever clear. The next day, I returned to the office and learned that Ed Martin was the interim U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. I was not familiar with him, but I learned that he did not have a positive opinion, to say the least, of the January 6th prosecutions. In his first week, he did a meet and greet where he introduced himself, talked about his background, and he also talked about his goals. He discussed his desire to clean up D.C. so the world could visit the president for the 250th anniversary of the United States. He wanted to fight violent crime in D.C. And so I thought it was possible I could continue to serve that office. I was wrong. After 3 weeks of training, and getting prepared for the next week, that Friday I left work. I walked to the metro station, I got on the train, and I pulled out my phone, and I saw a litigation hold that had been put on it. And attached to that was a memo that gave Mr. Martin permission to fire probationary employees from the Capitol Siege section that were moved to other places in the office. The memo referenced people, but didn't have a list of names attached. But the information provided was confusing. I knew I was probably on the list, but I didn't know exactly what was going on. I headed back to the office so I could figure out what was happening. I was met by my colleagues who shared their confusion and a heartbreak over this sudden event. We left the office, and 2 hours later, the letters started rolling in, terminating us. At the end of the night, 15 assistant U.S. attorneys had been fired. The termination letter I received stated the decision was based on your actions in the prosecution of persons relating to the events that occurred at or near the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. An executive order issued on January 20th, 2025, the president characterized that work as having involved a grave national injustice that has perpetrated upon the American people over the last 4 years. It went on to say that my hiring has hindered the ability of the acting U.S. Attorney Martin to staff his office in furtherance of his obligation to faithfully implement the agenda that the American people elected President Trump to execute. The termination letter made it clear to me that Mr. Martin does not understand the role of a prosecutor. U.S. attorneys represent the United States of America, not the president. Firing 15 qualified attorneys created an immediate deficit in the office to appropriately prosecute cases. Mr. Martin's stated mission when he started the U.S. Attorney's Office was to clean up Washington, D.C. and focus on violent crime. I am the exact type of person who a United States attorney should hire for that goal. Mr. Martin's actions are those of a political operative. He fails to grasp what it means to be a prosecutor. For Mr. Martin, it appears that prosecution is not about service to the community or this nation. He seems to lack an understanding of the sacred responsibility of being able to take away someone's freedom. He does not understand, he does not concentrate on his responsibility to victims of crime. His focus appears to be solely on serving the president instead of the people of Washington, D.C. and this country. He talks about cracking down on assaults against police officers, but he oversaw the dismissal of many assaults on law enforcement officers that happened on January 6th. Prosecution is not political, but Mr. Martin treats it as political. Prosecution is about following the law, the Constitution, and the evidence, and I worry that Mr. Martin will ignore these safeguards. The riot that happened on January 6th, it was violent and destructive. It was not a few bad actors that did a few bad things. It was massive and terrifying. It affected police officers protecting the building and the people who worked inside the Capitol. It was not peaceful. Nothing can change what happened that day. And I thank you for helping us to protect that record from those who want to whitewash an insurrection.
Thank you, Ms. Levine. Officer Hodges.
Good afternoon. I'm here in my personal capacity and not on behalf of my employer, but this is not where I wanted to be today. After the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021, after being beaten with blunt instruments, punched, kicked, having someone attempt to gouge out my eye, after being robbed, crushed, and bloodied, I was hopeful. I really thought that this has to be it. This has to be where the Republican Party finally takes the off-ramp from Donald Trump and his ilk. There's no way to cover this up. There's too much evidence. There's no way to make this look good. It was a violent insurrection, an attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power and thwart the will of the people. But my hope was far too optimistic. After it became apparent they would fail in their mission, Donald Trump finally stopped watching the brutality on TV and told them, "We love you. You're very special." The invertebrates in Congress, who not so long ago were cowering in their seats while my colleagues and I took the blows meant for them, started beating their chests, making excuses, crafting conspiracies, and outright lying about the events of the day. And years later, despite all the evidence of wrongdoing, despite the testimonies from Republicans in the Trump administration, despite trial after trial where insurrectionists were proven guilty of crimes beyond a reasonable doubt, it hasn't stopped. Quite the opposite. Now that Donald Trump, for reasons I cannot fathom, has secured a second term in office, revisionist historians have only gained more avenues with which to poison the well of truth. Despite a plaque honoring the sacrifice of my colleagues being created by Congress, that Pharisaic homunculus Mike Johnson refuses to install it as required by law. Ed Martin, the Nazi-supporting interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, has dismissed or reassigned dozens of prosecutors who worked on January 6 cases. He also had the temerity to post, "Hit a cop, you'll pay for it," on his social media after legally representing January 6 defendants and fundraising for Proud Boys. Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, the list goes on. And of course, there is everything Trump has done and is doing to indemnify, empower, and encourage his private militia to commit further acts of violence. On Inauguration Day this year, I worked approximately 14 hours to ensure the safety and security of all in attendance. At one point, I secured his travel route. He passed within feet of me as I kept others back from the street. When I got home, I learned that one of his first acts of his second term was to pardon or grant clemency to almost 1,600 convicts from the attack. Most recently, Trump has floated the idea of a fund for compensating insurrectionists. This bears repeating. Donald Trump effectively wants to pay people to assault, maim, and contribute to the deaths of police officers. He wants to pay them to show up to Washington at his command and fight to intimidate government officials into not serving as a check against the executive. And he wants them to know there will be no legal repercussions for them doing so. He's communicating this quite clearly to his thralls while he publicly flouts the 22nd Amendment, indicating that he's going to spit on the Constitution one last time in 2028 before, as he has called for in the past, terminating it completely. I could make this all about me. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I could talk about how I've been diagnosed with major depressive disorder, anxiety adjustment disorder, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I could talk about the threats I've received, people pasting pictures of my head on top of nooses, people telling me to kill myself, people sending me clips of snuff films, people trying to find out if I have a wife or kids to harass, people trying to get me fired for speaking out. I could talk about how law firms were afraid to go after those who defame me, saying they'd be targeted by the Trump administration for lawfare. But I've always been a big picture person, and at the end of the day, I'm just one man. It's the country that's in unprecedented danger. When last I testified on the Hill, it was in an effort to produce accountability for those in power. And despite the efforts of good people throughout this country, we failed. I'm here today with perhaps more modest goals. To fight the lies and preserve the truth. To warn whatever Americans are left that fascism is here and it's putting down roots. It's up to us to exercise our power every day to ensure that we are clear-sighted about the past, actively engaged in the present, and cognizant of the dangers of the near future before the power we have to shape our own destiny is